So welcome along everyone to Recording Scotland's Closing Churches, a Race Against Time. I'm DJ Johnson Smith. I'm the director of Scotland's Churches Trust, a little charity based in Scotland that was founded in 1978. Our roots are in 1978 with one of two charities. It's founded by Magnus Magnusson to protect and preserve Scotland's churches. We merged with the Scottish Churches Trust in 2012 and create Scotland's Churches Trust as you see it today. Did I say we merged with Scotland's Churches Trust? Or did I say the Scottish Churches Scheme? Too many acronyms. I'm joined tonight by two fantastic colleagues in the sector. Leslie Cumming is our lead volunteer here at Scotland's Churches Trust. It's fair to say that without Leslie's involvement, we wouldn't all be sitting here tonight, because it's been her drive and enthusiasm that's helped push our recording project along these last few years, particularly over the bump of COVID. We're also joined, I'm really grateful for Judith Roebuck, who's come along. She's the Sanctuary Development Officer for the Church of Scotland, with responsibility for heritage and planning across the nationwide estate belonging to the church. And she's redeveloping guidance on these matters that reflect the current paradigm that we find ourselves in. And she and her small team ensure planning procedures are followed with churches prior to sale. Now, I'm just going to share my screen. This is how we're going to, there we go. Hopefully you're all seeing that. And I'll move this out of the way because it's probably in your way, which I'll probably never find again. So the running order tonight, it's just a very quick introduction for myself and a little bit of background about our project. Then an introduction to how we record Closing Churches from Leslie. And a brief chat with Judith about the closure procedures and likely timeframes. And then that'll be followed with a Q&A from the floor, where we can have a chat and we can answer any questions that you've put in the chat. I know that I've received lots of questions as we've started to grow this project over the last few months. So hopefully we'll be able to answer as many of those tonight as possible. So first of all, I want to say we are where we are. There are new stories appearing every other day, it feels like, or at least every other week on your news feed, on the television, on social media, in the papers, about church closures or worse, cataclysmic fires or conflagrations that have destroyed churches. We're not looking back tonight. We're not looking really at how we've got to where we are. We're just going to deal with the situation as it stands today. Because we've got a task ahead of us, and I hope that's why there's over 100 people have booked this evening, so that we can move on and get and start to address what we've got to do. So the task ahead, we're going to look at what needs to be done. Discussions about why we're here. I'm afraid that's for a meeting another time, and it's not for tonight. And we can have that meeting another time. But tonight we're focusing on church recording and the processes and how we can do that in the months and year ahead. We have to acknowledge that Scotland has changed. It's a changed place over the last 25 and 30 years, over the last generation. But right now, Scotland's church buildings are experiencing an upheaval they haven't witnessed since the 19th century, since the disruption, really. We're going to see some serious changes coming, which have not been seen on this scale for 150 years. Hundreds of church buildings are going to close in the coming months and years, and many of these have been special places to their local communities for generations, up to 1,000 years in some places. What are we in danger of losing? Well, in the vast majority of cases, the exterior of these buildings is going to survive in one form or another. The interior might survive as well. It's the interior contents that concern us tonight. It's the little bits and pieces that have been gathered by over many generations in these churches, the investment that's been made in items in these buildings over centuries. And why is this important? Well, UNESCO has a very clear definition of what cultural heritage is, and it does include artifacts, it includes monuments, and it's about that diversity of values, the symbolism, the historic and artistic, aesthetic, ethnological and anthropological value, and its social significance. And that's what's built into the contents of churches across the country. And that's why we're sitting here tonight. So in 2019, I only came on board Scotland Churches Trust last year, but in 2019, my predecessor at Leslie and our trustees and our other volunteers, they came up with, they saw that the coming need for this national project, and they approached Historic Environment Scotland to seek a little bit of funding to try and launch a pilot project to develop a methodology of emergency recording. A plan that will empower and mobilize a small army of local volunteers who will go out and assist in preserving this vital cultural heritage. Sadly, the project launched in March of 2020, and something else came along that interfered just a little bit with the best laid plans. Our volunteers did the very best they could, and as regulations allowed, they visited some of the earliest churches over that period that were starting to depart, and tried to start making a record and bringing the project together, finding some best practice tips. And then my predecessor retired, so there was a little bit of a hiatus, and then I came on board, and we relaunched in August last year. Our primary goal, nice and simple, record. We just want to record the contents and add them to the HES archives to make sure that there's that it's maintained there. So we've now developed a methodology which will allow small groups of volunteers armed with little more than just a smartphone and a measuring tape and maybe a flask and a packed lunch to make a record which will have value to everyone that chooses to use it in the future. And they can do this, most importantly, in less than a day in a small church. We're still developing this methodology, but mainly it will need a lead volunteer, each local group who will help clean up the data that has been collected online by the volunteers, and hopefully produce a short report and upload all of that to the HES archives. And we're working on an advice handbook and templates to make this as easy as possible going forward. But I'm not going to talk any more about that because that's Leslie's, and I'm not trying to eat into her presentation. So over to Leslie. So she's going to tell you a little bit more about the project. I'll just stop sharing my screen, Leslie, and that should let you be able to share yours.
Yeah. Evening, everybody. Thank you, DJ. I'll just set up my share. Can everyone see that?
Yes, it's looking good.
Yeah. Okay. Right. Well, I'm Leslie, and I'm a retired chartered librarian and information scientist. And I first got involved with Scotland Churches Trust because my wonderful husband suggested I could offer to help with database entry in the SCT office. That's Adam, who's now actually our chairman of SCT. But then the church recording project was mooted, and volunteering for that really appealed more than sitting in the office, because I thought, oh, spending some time in a sacred space, classifying, cataloguing, recording information about its contents, I thought, oh, what's not to like? And I was right, because it's been very interesting so far. And I sometimes have to stop myself from boring my friends with all the fascinating things that we've found. And it's not working. I apologize. I can't move on. Oh, there we go. Yes, well, that's the second slide. And we found this totally unexpectedly in the Church of Bissett Sinclair in Fife, and we all got very excited. And I also got very excited when I opened the vestry cupboard in Oldhamstock's church, and this beautiful sampler tumbled out. So it's great fun, really is. But as DJ said, churches are repositories for much of the social history of their communities. So it's important not only to record it, but to actually make it publicly available. And that's why we're going to send all the reports to Historic Environment Scotland, and they put it on their Canmore database. Now, some of you may know that Canmore is not the easiest website to search, but I understand that HES is embarking on a project to change that. And I think you can actually volunteer to help them to do that. And our reports go on to the section of Canmore called the Trusted Digital Depository Archive, which really means it's just future-proofed to keep up with changes in technology over the years. So now let's have a little fast forward to 2020 and imagine a woman in Canada who's researching her family history. She's traced her Scottish ancestry back to a little place called Dissett in Fife. And she knows that in the 19th century, most folk were involved in their local church. And she finds an online database called Canmore, and she decides to do a search. And to her joy, she finds a report called SET Dissett St Clair Church Recording Report. This is a picture of the church, and starts looking for the surname she's interested in, Reddy. And to her joy, there it was, a memorial inscription, which you can see gives a lot of information about her family and her ancestor, Lavinia, who apparently was a noble, unselfish, or lived a noble, unselfish, God-fearing life. But back to the present, how does Church Recording Project actually work? As DJ said, there's a very simple online form which volunteers use to record notes and photographs about each object in the church. And I have to say, I am so grateful to DJ for creating this online form, because it really makes things easy. And you don't have to have detailed knowledge of church architecture or to know the technical terms. DJ maybe show us a bit more of that form later on. Pre-pandemic, we managed to record 4 churches, but we just made notes on paper, and we had a separate photographer taking the pictures. And guess who got the job of writing up the notes, deciphering different people's handwriting and matching up the photographs. But we do, however, still have the paper templates if they are needed. There are some practical issues about visiting a church. Even if a minister or a session clerk dismissively says, oh, there's not much to record in this church, we always find lots. And it's best to prepare to be there for the whole day. And as DJ said, tea, coffee and sandwiches are a must. And I also like to check that there will be access to a kettle and toilets. And last but not least, wrap up warm, as the folk who recorded Moreham Church last week will tell you. And this is a photograph of me at Roxburgh Church beside their Lammermuir pipe organ, and it was cold. So the online recording form leads you step by step through describing an item. You first give it a name. For instance, it might be an offering plate. And then from a drop-down list, you select which of the 10 categories we use that it falls into. When groups are recording, some groups like to take a different category each. Maybe some people want to do the musical instruments, some people want to do the windows, but other groups do it differently and just split up the church, saying, oh, you do the nave, I'll do the sanctuary, or whatever. It works in different ways. But let's give you some examples of the different categories. So first of all, archival material. For example, things like proclamations of banns, and shown here is a nice register of services. And then you get library material. This is anything, any books, hymnals, prayer books, not just the lectern Bibles and the sets of hymn books that are out in use, but you actually need to check in cupboards for the older material. And that can be very rewarding. I was actually sorting out a music cupboard in my own church recently, and I found a very rare leather-bound copy of a book called The Parish of Cramond by a Mr. Wood, which was published in 1794. Looked it up on Google, and I think it's worth about £1,500. So that was a find. And we do find when we go into churches that sometimes they don't know what they've got in their cupboards. So open all the cupboards. Memorials are fairly self-explanatory. They can be war memorials or memorials to individuals. They can be wall-mounted plaques like this one, which is again from Dissett St Clair to James Meikle, but you often find small metal memorial plaques on pieces of furniture as well. So you have to look carefully. Then we go on to metalwork. A huge range of items in this category. You know, you can get book rests, the communion cups you see there, flagons, communion dishes and baskets, vases for the flowers, which somebody might have donated, and there might be an inscription on it, and even the old communion tokens. You always have to have a miscellaneous item. This can be anything at all, from wooden donation boxes maybe to glass candle holders, or even maybe a sundial on an exterior wall. And this is the Edinburgh Merchant Company plaque from Roxburgh Kirk. Musical instruments, as I said, some people like to specialize in these. Organs, clavinovas, electronic organs, pianos. This is an organ in Uiasound Church on Unst in Shetland. And in case you're thinking, I've been to Shetland, I haven't. This is a very good example where a group of local enthusiasts got together and recorded 3 of their churches which were being closed. Paintings and sculptures. This basically covers, paintings and murals, I should say. This basically covers anything that's in a frame. Can be a drawing, cross-stitch pictures, as we've seen, collages, photographs, maps. And this is a rather nice line drawing of Galatown Kirk, which was hanging in Viewforth Church. And this is my favorite category. This is textiles. And that includes communion tablecloths, pulpit falls and banners. And again, you have to look in the cupboards, because obviously some of the banners might be specific to a particular time of year and might be stuck in a cupboard. But these are gorgeous. These are as a part of a set of seat cushions from Dissett St Clair with all the different hymn tune names on them. I think they're great. And then windows. And again, windows can be memorial windows. And in fact, this is the war memorial window from my own church in Cramond. And last but not least, we have to record all the wooden furniture, and that's another big category, because it includes chairs, lecterns, it could be flower stands, it could be hymn boards, tables, pews, and that's one of 2 communion tables in Smailham Kirk. So the online form tells you what information to enter, because it prompts you. It says, where is the item in the church? So you just say it's on the communion table, it's on the west wall, or whatever. And then it says, what is it made of? And of course, the broad category might be metal, but then you might be able to add more of a description and type in brass or wrought ironwork, or even, if you're lucky, silver. Are there any maker's marks, you'll be asked. Very often organs and pianos will have a little maker's plaque. And what size is it? Put in the height and the width and the depth. Are there any memorial plaques on the particular object? And the wording of these needs to be recorded in full. So it's a bit like playing detective. You need to examine items from every angle. In my own church, I thought we used quite plain offering plates, but one day I looked more closely, and you may not be able to see that very clearly, but I found an inscription, and it was for the tercentenary of Cramond Kirk. And here's another example. It's a chair, but it's in memory of David Patterson. There is also a form called likely destination of an item, if you know that once the church is being closed. And we recorded a Viewforth Church in Kirkcaldy before it closed. And this is a very small memorial window, which was actually in the vestry. But we were told that there was no inscription or any details about it, but we were told that it had been reclaimed by the donor. So, you know, there's a possibility to put in that item has gone somewhere else. I have to say that now I'm a church recording volunteer, I find I'm much, much more observant when visiting churches and any historic building. I've been to Crichton Collegiate Church several times, but with my new church recording eyes, as I call them. I only spotted this Mouseman mouse on its font last year. And I put that photo on Twitter, and it created quite a bit of interest. And I thought it might be the only Mouseman mouse in a church in Scotland. But at Christmas, I was at a carol service in Holy Cross, Davidson's Mains, and there I spotted another Mouseman mouse on the candle holder. So I was very pleased. I have to say, to finish with, that I actually think I'm addicted to church recording now, because it's really interesting. And I'd love to record my own church, Cramond Kirk. This is a picture of it during last year's Doors Open Day. Now, we're not threatened with closure at the moment. And books have been written about the architecture and history of Cramond Kirk. But I think what's missing is still the social history attached to all the artifacts in the building, the detail of the people who worship there, and the importance of the kirk to the local community. And because the SCT online form is so easy to use, I'm sure I could get some friends to join in, and we could record all this useful information for Cramond Kirk. I invented a slogan for myself when I started volunteering for this project, and this is it: church recording is rewarding. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Leslie. Well, before we move over to Judith, what I might just do is quickly show you. We're not going to go into huge detail about how to do this, but if I share my screen again, and I'll show you the online recording form that Leslie mentioned there. So I'll just share my screen one more time. Let me just get rid of that, and I'll share. So this is it. When we create an online recording form for each church or each building that's going to be recorded, the lead volunteer is made an owner of that, a co-owner of that, and sends sends it along to all of the volunteers a link, and they simply have it on their smartphone or their tablet, go into the church, and they do it. Hopefully there's internet, 4G of some kind, 3G. That might not always be the case, so you might have to resort to paper and pen and then do this later. But certainly 3 of the 4 churches that I've done recently have all had 4G and have allowed me to do it. So it's more or less a possibility that this will happen, but not always. So what it looks like when on your phone, is just something along this line, and it is just that simple. You work your way down. Let's say lectern. You choose your category. So that would be metalwork, let's say, material, brass, position in church, sanctuary. I might try and get my spelling right for once. And you do all of this on your phone or your tablet. Description of the item, as much detail as you can put in. We've seen some lovely lecterns recently, eagle lecterns with claw feet and on a ball, maybe with. So you would put your description in there, usually a paragraph or so. The next box is for memorial inscriptions. So whatever dedication that there might be, often it's been a donation of the local WI group or whatever it may be. You put that in there. Then you record the measurements, the history, anything that's known. You might have a session clerk on hand, or a church warden of some kind, or a church officer, or a volunteer, or just a member of the congregation who might be able to tell you that lectern was a gift from someone, or it came from another church that perhaps had closed. That's the space where you record that. You can add any other relevant notes. As Leslie mentioned, you can add in the likely destination if known. Now that's mostly going to be left blank, but it was just in the off chance so that future researchers might be able to track that item down if it's perhaps going to the nearby church, the church that's going to be joined. It's most likely that war memorial will move to the neighbouring church that has now formed a union with the closing church. And then finally, most importantly, is the image. You can add up to 5 images straight from your phone. You can take the photographs first and add them later, or you can take it as you're doing it, which is my favorite way of doing it. And these are all immediately then sent to a Google Cloud where they're held for your lead volunteer to come back to and assess afterwards. I've tried to make that simple. It will develop according to the church that you're in, but it's all there on your phone to make it as simple as possible. Because one of the hardest tasks that Leslie, I think, found was she was left with lots and lots of pieces of paper, trying to make sense of it and trying to connect it all together. So, well, I see questions are starting to come in. We'll save all those until the end, but we're going to move over now and have a chat with Judith, who's joined us from the Church of Scotland, so she can tell us a little bit more about what's happening with closures and how she would like to see volunteers, because this isn't a process where it's just a free for all. This has got to be done very sensitively and carefully, and with the blessing, we hope, of the Church of Scotland and any other denomination, because it isn't just the Church of Scotland. We shouldn't be focusing just on the Church of Scotland. It's just the Church of Scotland is perhaps the high focus at the moment, but there are other denominations, and they are also closing their church buildings. So over to yourself, Judith.
Okay, thank you, and hello everybody. What I'd like to say is I used to be the secretary of the Church Art and Architecture Committee, and although we don't have the committee anymore, we have always done church recording. We've always done inventories. However, having lost a committee of 16 people who used to do it, I'm now down to a team of staff of 5 really who can do this. So I actually welcome the fact that we've got more capacity, but it will not overrule the Church of Scotland processes. And perhaps I ought to say something about the actual process of closure. And it's really unfortunate that there are going to be a lot of closures, and it's very much mission-led, because essentially there's too many churches in Scotland, and churches have closed actually there was a major process of closure in the 70s as well. So churches have always closed, because you very often find 2 churches in the same settlement, and 2 of which have been after coming back together, that there's been 2 churches owned by the Church of Scotland in the same settlement. So there has always been a process of closure. But having said that, the current process of presbytery planning, which is very much a mission plan, so not really led by the buildings, is fewer people are coming to church, and there's too many buildings, and a lot of with aging congregations, fewer people, they've got less money to maintain them, so there's quite a lot of the churches are not in very good condition. And so, so that is sort of one of the things, because we've got fewer people going to church, sort of actually trying to maintain the level of buildings has just become impossible. There's also a lot fewer ministers, and so it is very much a large-scale rationalisation, but it is, it's mission-led. But having said that, the general trustees are supportive of the idea of the right, so a well-equipped space in the right places. And so it's very much looking at where the congregations, where the worshipping people are. And there's also a move to actually develop new churches, new forms of church. So it's not an entirely oblique picture, but it is having a major impact on historic buildings. What I'd also like to say is the process, so there's a very formal process of closure, and it's very, I won't go into the technical details, but actually presbytery, the congregation, depending on how it's done, the congregation actually gets a vote about whether they're to close, unless it's part of presbytery adjustment, which obviously in this case, a lot of them are. It's very much a matter of, sort of lots of unions find themselves with 5 buildings, and it's then choosing the best fit for so for where there might be growth in the congregations, and so actually just reducing yeah, so we're looking towards sustainability, I suppose. But yeah, we've always had this formal process, but it has to be agreed by presbytery before it actually comes to the general trustees. Although the general trustees are the property owning arm of the church, and yeah, so things as closures have to be agreed with the general trustees, unless they're locally owned, which a few of them are. Yeah, so and then yeah, so there's a formal process that it goes to the general trustees board, and then it's passed to the law department. But in between that, before the law department can put something on the market, they have to have seen my report. So yeah, and we've always done closure reports, but not at the level that we're seeing now. So yeah, I welcome this project, but yes, it's a matter of trying to do it in a systematic way, and yes, in a way that the church themselves have to have a say. Absolutely. And one of the things I'd also like to say is we actually have a complete database of all the communion ware, so there's really no reason for you to record it, because we provide that. Yeah, we get the congregations to check, and yeah, so and we've got the whole lot valued. Yeah, and they cannot sell unless they get our permission. So yeah, so the communion ware is not, yeah, we do allow for sale, but it's yeah, the criteria were set down in 1997 by the General Assembly, because before that date, every decision about disposing of communion ware had to be a decision of the General Assembly. And obviously at that point, it was just not practical to do that. So we have a small communion ware committee which looks at the criteria for disposal, and it's quite strict, and they can't just sell it to put into their general funds. Yeah, if we agree to sale or for, you know, sort of museums things, they actually have to allocate the money not towards building maintenance but towards mission. So there's, yeah, so the communion ware is a very different process to the closure of a church. We also we've been criticised in the past for asset stripping historic churches, yeah, sort of listed buildings. We do not do that anymore. So yeah, so as soon as a church is closed, we lose ecclesiastical exemption, and so we have no right to remove fixtures from a listed building. And to do that, we have to apply for listed building consent in the same way that everybody else does. So that is why, yeah, the most of the fixtures are sold with the building. And then obviously, if they're sold to private individuals, they have to apply for listed building consent to the local authority in the way that everybody does. There are occasions when, for various reasons, the congregation are very attached to, say, a stained glass window, and they wish to move that either to their surviving church building or to be in a light box within the building. And if possible, we do that, but you know, we have to get listed building consent. The local authority have to agree to what goes back in its place. Yeah, so we do not just allow buildings to be boarded up, because that's not good either for the building, but also for the potential vandalism that causes. In terms of memorials, again, we work quite closely with the War Memorials Trust, and we do, you know, we have an obligation to try and maintain public access to war memorials, and so those are the things that do get moved. And a lot of churches don't actually like this, you know, because, you know, sometimes that, you know, so a church, yeah, with a union, it is the best. It is a completely new congregation. It is not just the old, and yes, and it's not just that one church is surviving, and so therefore they can just dismiss everything from the other church. Yeah, it is a union, and we're supposed to be preserving the best from both, so that they can go forward in a more positive way. And that can, you know, people do get very attached to, you know, so to the history of some of the objects, And so we encourage that you do an inventory, not only of the closing building, but of the one that is surviving. And so we can, so there can be decisions made about the best things to keep. And I know the surviving churches don't always like that. But that's, so we're looking at a positive missional thing. And closing a church is a grieving process. And so I know DJ has had quite a lot of this, but I spent, so we always do sort of inventories, closure visits with 2 people as a minimum, because one person, usually me, ends up doing the talking, dealing with the grief side of things, while the other person sort of takes on the bulk of the recording. So in theory, I take the photo. So I usually have another person who will sort of take. So we do it online. We have a recording form very similar to the one that DJ has devised. We do it straight onto the laptop. I have some admin people who have trained up to do this. So I talk, they type usually. And in some cases, we can split into 2. My permanent assistant has done a lot of these with me. She's quite capable of doing them. So we split, if necessary, we split into 2 teams. And we do as much as we can in a day. I also take incredibly detailed photographs so that, and we do record all the memorials, because over the years, I have learned that I get inquiries 10 years after a church is closed about what's happened to a memorial. So, so I just want to assure people we have always done it, but we've never faced the level of closure that we're facing now. And so any help, is welcome. But the other thing I need to say is that the furniture, the movable items, belong to the congregation. And although we advise, other than war memorials and communion wear, I can't dictate. And and I've looked at an awful lot of churches over the years, and I can tell you that 90% of the furniture is fairly standard. There are obviously the inscriptions that make it specific to an individual church, and then I would say 10% are really unusual. And it's actually identifying those items and leaning very heavily, I will say, on the congregations that something is either has to be retained or has to be offered to a museum. Sort of depending what it is. But and again, I would agree with Leslie that you need to check the books, because I came across a bishop's Bible fairly recently, which again are quite rare. And it apparently had not been recorded the first time round because it had been in the ministers, it had been in the manse, and it was only when the minister left. I mean, we've been with the church for a very long time, and it was only when somebody cleared out the manse that they then reunited it with the congregation. So there are really exciting things in churches. But and I mean, at the moment, just to say, we haven't got a definitive list at the moment. The presbytery plans were supposed to be all in and agreed by the end of December. That, in fact, has not happened. We're about 3/4 of the way there. And the other thing is that in the presbytery plans, there are some, so they're either A, which is to be retained, or B, to potentially be disposed of. But a lot of the Bs are actually waiting for congregations to make the decision about which church to be retained. And so it's not all the Bs will be disposed of. And it's, so it's, again, it's to be equitable. Well, yes, they look at the practicalities of which church is the best to retain. And in some cases, it's, so it might be the church hall rather than the church. And it's a lot of that then does come down to the condition of the building. And I will say, the Church of Scotland will always claim that we're not a heritage, we're a religious organisation, not a heritage body, even though we have an awful lot of important buildings which are very much a reflection of the history of Scotland. And so there is a tension.
There is.
And so I come from a heritage background, and I find the number of closures difficult. But I can also see that the current position is just not sustainable. And so I've just had to accept that we need to do the best that we can to make sure that there is a detailed record. I will also say that Simon Green from Historic Environment Scotland has, again, always recorded from an architectural point of view, has always had a small team to do church recording, and he is doing a lot more of that at the moment. But I think Simon's possibly on the call. But and again, we've always had a dialogue and try and prioritise, because again, to say about the presbytery plans, some of them are for fairly immediate closure, others are not due to close till 2027. So again, what I'm trying to do is to get a list of when we think the presbyteries are putting in for the closure. But even though it's in the presbytery plan, I suspect that not all of them will happen in quite the timescale that is envisaged. But again, we're trying to work on the worst case scenario so that we are prioritising which ones need to happen sooner rather than later, because it's really important that the congregation actually have a say in the process. I know people say, oh, the general trustees are closing the churches. This is not the case. It's the presbyteries that are looking at what missional requirements are, and that does have an impact on the number of buildings that are retained. But I think that's probably that's a wonderful.
You've given us. I mean, you are in a terrible position. There's no doubt at all, and we are where we are. So this project is there to try and find a way forward that will make as good a record as possible. There's been so many questions coming in, there's so many comments, but I am aware that my wonderful colleague in this part of the sector, Victoria Collins, is with us, and I'm going to bring her on screen if she's happy to do that, so that she can tell us a little bit more about, in particular, hopefully that worked. She might be appearing just shortly. In particular, what we haven't talked about there's another reason for doing this. Things can be lost. Things can easily be lost in this. And last year, many of you will have known the tragic fire of Lundy Parish Church after it was sold the year before into private hands. And sadly, the contents, the interior was entirely destroyed. The roof was gone. Everything was gone of this wonderful little church in Fife. And Victoria's wonderful organisation, she's the director of Historic Churches Scotland, and she has assisted over, I'm not going to say several decades, over the last few years. Victoria has assisted churches in transition as they move out of permanent places of worship into community focus. Hi, Victoria, thanks for jumping on this evening. You've been sharing some wonderful thoughts. Do you have any observations to begin before we open up the Q&A?
I think, I was really struck by Judith talking about how difficult this process is for everybody concerned, and I think it's sort of beholden on all of us to try to achieve the best outcome for these buildings. Yes, the scale of loss is deeply upsetting, but if we can achieve good things out of recording the buildings. I was interested by Joe Trainor's comment about the sort of oral history and intangible cultural heritage there. I think people's association, their kinship with buildings, that's a really important thing to capture. And I think if we can work together to to try and achieve the best outcome in a very, very trying time.
Absolutely.
But
Absolutely.
yes, I mean, the point you made, DJ, you talked about the loss, terrible loss of the church at Lundy, category A listed, with a really important mausoleum attached to it, and the value of even the limited recording that we had done while we were working with the community there has paid dividends. So you can't always anticipate how important the information is. Leslie's point about people in the future will want to use this, but its value, I think, is undisputed.
It's and it's in the intangibles that Leslie talked about as well. It's the we don't know today what someone will value in the future. I know when I go in, so at Moramkirk at the weekend, 5 of us recorded contents of this little church, and upstairs in the vestry are the contents of effectively a little lending library that clearly was lent out over the middle decades of the 20th century, and the books are filled with inscriptions of the individuals who owned them. So we've made a record of all of that. That's not of any intrinsic value. That's of cultural value to someone down the line. It shows what people were reading, what people were actively engaged in. And it will prove of value in the future. These are the little treasures that we find. I'm good. As time is going on, we'll look at some of these questions. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on any of them. We'll just start at the top, and please do add in questions, ladies and gentlemen who are in the audience, into the Q&A section. You'll see in the left-hand side, then we can easily see them. Does the project include church halls or just churches themselves? From Barbara. I can answer that. If a church hall is worth recording, I don't think anyone at the Hess Archives is going to mind that you've made a record of the contents of the hall as well. If it's something that you think before it passes in, if it's been a church hall that's been used for years, and the cupboards are filled with the china from the Rural Institute and a collection of books and maybe a small lending library, I think it's important that should be recorded too. So this is a volunteer-led project, so we're going to be led by what you think is important and should be recorded.
I would say that you sometimes find sort of ecclesiastical furniture from a previous closure in the church hall, so it is worth having a look.
And that's it's a very important point, because this isn't a new process. Churches have been shutting for decades, and as they've merged in, these items have landed in churches, and they haven't always been made their way into the sanctuary. So Morag asks, to what extent is this reinventing the wheel? Are we certain that the church hasn't already been recorded in some way? She'd spent a year inputting data into the database for the Council of Scottish Archaeology in the 1980s and the early 90s, and hundreds of churches were recorded. Does this overlap with ours? Leslie, do you have a view on that? Or
I don't know about that project, but what I would say is to me the main thing is where the information ends up. Even if information was recorded, one of the most important aspects of our project is that it's publicly available. And so, if recording has been done, but it's somewhere that no member of the public could ever access, then in a way, what use is it? And what use is it to the community if they can't actually access it? Obviously, you don't want to reinvent the wheel. I totally agree with Morag. That would be pointless. But I think we need to get this, if this information is there, we need to get it publicly available. And the best way to do that is Canmore. Because it's a publicly available database that's supported by Historic Environment Scotland, it's future-proofed. And when we were starting this project, we had the option to either do a paper copy of the report and give the paper copy to Historic Environment Scotland, but then they just put it in their library, and they put a catalogue record up on their database. But to actually read the report, you would have to go to the archives, and that's no use if you're, not in Edinburgh. So we are depositing electronic copies of our reports, which will then be searchable and fully available to anybody anywhere in the world down the line. So while I agree you don't want to reinvent the wheel, I think it's extremely important that all the information that we record is publicly available and easily accessible.
Barbara adds, can we add to the initial records? This is a very practical question. If we find out more later, there has to be an end date for this particular thing you're doing. So I think you have to set a boundary for your volunteers to say, this is the point where we hope that you've added everything you need to add. But it will be up to yourselves as we do this, as this process unfolds. Does the information captured end up as a catalogue, one for each church with text and photographs for each item? Yes, it will do. Is there any movement to video recording entire churches with the with virtual reality and other things? I have actually been in talk with archaeological units. I don't know if you have, Judith. You had a wry smile there.
We've actually did a small project a few years ago when we did do 3D recording of churches, and some of them are publicly available, and you can do walk around with them. Unfortunately, it was a trial project, and so we were hoping that churches would take up this as an idea themselves, and very few have. But we do have the so things like Dalmelly, for instance, just outside Edinburgh, we do have a 3D record.
And can people view that? Is it on the Church of Scotland's website? And it is very exciting where technology is landing now, laser scanning and 3D photogrammetry. There are many different things we do. That's not for this particular project. It's not necessarily accessible to everyone, so we kept this as simple as we possibly can. But that's not to stop you from doing it if you have the permission of the congregation, and it's being done with them. And you can find someone with a nice laser scanner who's prepared to do it. That would be wonderful, or some 3D or 4D photogrammetry. More, I guess, where is this going to end up? I think as we said, it's the Historic Environment Scotland archives. I can't answer questions for Historic Environment Scotland on what their collection policies are. In general, though, Judith, do you want to maybe just talk about items of records?
Yeah, the National Record of Scotland, the Church's official record archive, and so all church. And again, this is nothing to do with Carter. This is the Principal Clerk's office that deals with this. But when a church closes, all the records of both churches should go to the National Archive, and obviously the new congregation starts afresh. So obviously there's data protection aspects to it, so they don't go on public access until so all those things are sorted out. Mm-hmm. But churches are supposed to deliver to 121 George Street, where we have a regular pickup by the National Record Scotland. So there, I will say that I know locally some people find this difficult, but again, that's our official policy, and there is a receiver of record, and it is their decision, so whether once they've been properly catalogued, whether they, so there are some archives that the records do go out to a local depository. I mean, for instance, Shetland is an official depository. So although the records have come back to Edinburgh, we're fully expecting that they will go back to the Shetland archive. But I mean, I discovered recently that actually even the churches in England and the international churches are still deposited in Scotland. So,
thank you. I hope that's answered the question. when it comes to Hess's collection policy, where I perhaps drop them a line and to answer your question directly, Colin asks if we actively seek out some records, as he's found land titles can be very useful. Again, this is going to be down to the level of detail that you want. At the moment, we're not going into the detailed recording efforts that I know have been done over many years by some excellent volunteer work. But this is emergency recording. This is the I'm an archaeologist background. This is what we do in advance of the developer moving in. We're trying to make a solid record of what's available today. So the history, if we have a book, if we one church we recorded in October, the church historian was on hand and was filling in the details about the background of the church. So that his information has been fed in to the short report that we're producing, but that's entirely up to you as individuals, what you do. We're not being prescriptive about this. This is we're trying to make this as a simple and straightforward, as robust a process as possible.
Can I also say that the Church of Scotland is not responsible for graveyards. Local authorities own and are responsible for the graveyards.
Yeah. In Scotland, for those that don't know, I think it's the 1925 Act that transferred them to local authorities. So the churches themselves have no responsibility for often for the state of the tombs that are outside. Recordings are available in the public, given to the community. Yes, they will be publicly available as time. There might be a time lag because some of this material will be waiting until the church has closed for obvious reasons. So there may be a time lag before it was made public. But what we're trying to do is make this national snapshot now that will eventually be made publicly available.
And can I just add there, DJ, that HES was as everyone else was badly hit by COVID and furloughed a lot of their archive staff. So there was a bit of a backlog, but I think they're getting through it.
And there's a question there for you, Judith. If you've recorded a church prior to the church being sold, is this information then held in the trusted digital repository, which you mentioned earlier?
It depends what you mean by the trusted digital repository.
I think that's Canmore, which I mentioned.
We haven't routinely put things on Canmore. We have some concerns, again, until a church is closed, to do with church security, particularly about the communion ware, but also, providing detailed lists of exactly where things are is potentially putting the churches at risk. So we haven't routinely made this public. But I think once the church is closed, there's absolutely no reason why we couldn't.
Interesting question from Annette about stained glass windows of closing churches. Maybe Victoria would like to come in on this, because you've been responsible for churches after they've closed as places of worship and stained glass windows. And then Judith as well about.
Yeah, I think there are various different things that happen, sometimes depending on the use that the building is going to be put to. They will remain in situ. Leslie mentioned the reclaiming of a stained glass window from a church, but obviously that has to be done with the necessary planning consents. Judith will know more about this, but in some cases where there is a war memorial window, that these can be removed to a place where they are still publicly accessible if the reuse of the building meant that they would become closed off to people. So Judith, do you want to say something about war memorials?
We don't routine. Well, the problem with moving a stained glass window is it needs listed building consent to do it. You have to have a suitable location to put it in the new church or in a light box. So you have to think about what's going to happen to it. And the other thing is that most local authorities insist on it's not just removing the window. They insist on something appropriate being put back into the hole that's left, and it can be quite expensive. So it really is a matter of whether the congregations have the money to do that. I'm very conscious that there are, so again, the Scottish Stained Glass Symposium has done quite a lot of recording of stained glass windows. They are talking to HES at the moment about sort of moving their archive over to HES. Again, there are various, I routinely record the windows at the subject matter and any inscriptions on them. But as I said, we don't routinely move windows, but it does for even more memorial windows. It's a really tricky situation. Sort of in that we try, but it's not always possible.
Thank you. Bruce asks, is this an opportunity to reach out beyond the congregation, out to the wider community who might value the church in a different way? I would say yes. I think there's people are nodding around the room.
Yes.
We're trying to find, our little charity has been trying to find ways to make churches, church buildings, places of worship, religious buildings sustainable. That's what we've been doing for 50 years, to try and get people to go inside churches again, to see what's inside these buildings. Different denominations have different reasons for wanting you to come into churches, but from our conservation point of view, we're trying to make these buildings, they have been community buildings for a very long time, and this is another purpose for going in. It's not under ideal circumstances if the building is about to close in its original purpose, but perhaps it may spark interest because the building may end up in the open market next, and if there's a community group out there, or if there's a new renewed community purpose, maybe this will be the spark that it needs. Leslie, do you want to jump in on that? Is there anything you on or anybody else want to jump in on community coming in?
Yeah, could I just say something there, DJ, because I think it's a great point by Bruce, and certainly for Historic Churches Scotland, we are very conscious that for almost any church, they are almost like the mini museum of the community through generations. And it's about not just the community collectively, it's individuals, and what's happened to a church over time kind of charts the history of the building and the people in it. And these are community buildings. So I think that to be able to reach beyond the worshipping congregation to the wider community and invite them in to see the extraordinary wealth of information in there, that actually it's about where they live, it's about sense of place, sense of community, and it's so important to share that as widely as possible.
Absolutely, thank you. Jennifer has asked a very specific question about her church has been closed for over a year and they're waiting for permission to move artifacts. I don't want to draw you on a specific church, but maybe just talk to the general notion of that.
Right. I think, Jennifer, if you'd like to contact me directly and tell me which church it is. And again, it depends to a certain extent where it is on the presbytery process, in that it may or may not have come to the board.
I'd rather than sharing Judith's emails in this public Zoom, if you write to me, Jennifer, I'll pass it along to Judith so that she can get your message. But just in the general, it's down to the congregations having that discussion at a presbytery level. Is that right, Judith? And then no,
there's a formal process that the general trustees have to receive a formal minute from the presbytery to actually to give us a closure date before officially anything can happen with them.
And that's the point where you would consider the removal of a communion table, for example.
Again, it depends. If you stop, it used to be that as soon as an announcement was made about closure, that worship stopped. That isn't necessarily the case now, because as soon as you stop worshipping in a church, one, you lose ecclesiastical exemption, and two, the insurance goes up.
Right.
So there was a modification a few years ago where it was decided that basically people can, again, depends slightly on the circumstances, can continue to worship, have a specific closure date, and at which point it is formally closed. Some churches do formal closure services. It's not compulsory, but many like to do that. Because of course the difference with Church of Scotland churches to England is that they are not consecrated buildings, so they're not formally deconsecrated either.
Right. That leads neatly into Susie's question about if you are interested in helping record your local church, do you ask the minister or the elders? What would be your advice to begin there?
My advice would be we're quite happy to support this particular project. I think I need to know which ones you're doing,
right,
to actually just to stop me duplicating, because as we've found, haven't we, there have been a couple where we've both done it.
Yeah. And
so
we're keen to do that.
Ideally, and again, we've just produced both the process guidance and also the sort of things that I ask for as part of an inventory. And I mean, again, ideally, the congregation actually start that process off, because they're the ones that actually know how much they feel about things and actually will have views about where things should go. It's unusual for congregation members not to have views. I mean, sometimes they're so fed up, they just want to walk away from it. But yes, so my view is, but the way I start is I encourage the congregation to start the inventory off themselves, because it's a way of engaging the locals with the process. I inevitably end up adding to it, visiting. There are occasions when there are amazing people who just say, tell me what you want me to do. And they have provided all the photographs, done a form, provided all the photographs. And actually, I then just need to go through the formal process of what should happen.
And I should point out, it isn't, I've said this already, but it isn't just the Church of Scotland. There are other churches involved here. This is, we're trying to create a toolkit to make this happen as easily as possible. If you're on this call and you're a member of a congregation, you're thinking, I want to do this ourselves, that's fabulous. But we have to be acutely aware this is a very sensitive issue. This is going to be very hard for some people. You may, some people in this call may just want to go out and do this straight away, but that's not how this is going to work, because these buildings have been are special places to the remaining congregation. So it's always got to be done with a great deal of sensitivity in mind. So we'll thank you for that question. There's a mixture of questions in the Q&A and in the webinar chat. Sally Garden has added personal memorials and walls, floors cannot be touched, moved without the permission of the family. And the law is very clear. How is it intended that these will be properly protected and families traced and contacted in accordance with the law? Sorry, Judith, that sounds like one for you.
Again, as a matter of course, we do not move personal memorials. Sometimes families, it can be traced, sometimes they can't. And again, they are fixtures, so they do belong with the listing. And so again, I mean, I've dealt with quite sensitive things in church in East Lothian, where, so basically the people who have bought the church for turning into a house, they have been forced by the local authority to retain the memorials. Sort of, again, it's got political sensitivity, that particular one, but yeah. So
I suppose
hopefully shouldn't get memorials turning up on skips. It has happened in the past, and I won't say it won't ever happen, but it shouldn't.
But it feeds into what you discussed in your piece earlier, that once it ceases to be a place of worship, all planning regulations apply, and people should not be ripping them out, no matter who, whether it's a community organisation or a private individual or a business. They shouldn't be taking pieces out without going through the due planning process for each of these buildings. Maybe there's a corollary. I'll throw in a question, because there has been a few questions about graveyards and burials. It's not tradition. Most people in the call will know it's not, the post-Reformation tradition is not for burials in Church of Scotland, but there are several pre-Reformation churches that do have, and there are some post-Reformation churches where it also happened, depending on where it is in Scotland. What's the general thought on that, Judith, on burials within churches? How will that be handled?
Again, they are sold with the building. It depends. There will be medieval buildings which have got burials beneath the floor. And again, it becomes a planning matter. Because so the regulations is that they shouldn't be moved, and it can. There have been occasions where there are burial vaults within a church, and so they are sold within the legislation of the law, and it can sometimes prevent a sale.
I mean, that's certainly something that comes to me quite regularly in my inbox. People say, "Oh, but we've got it." So that's quite clear that won't stop the sale, but it comes with its own responsibilities. Good friend Lucy from SPAB Scotland has asked quite a few questions there. What's our expected rollout of this for this recording? I hope she's talking about the recording for this, maybe, or the recording of tonight. If that is what it is, that'll be going out on YouTube as soon as I can manage to edit it. Might have to wait till after half term at this stage. But in general, for the recording of churches, well, as Judith mentioned, there are security issues depending on what we've recorded in a building. So it may always be that they won't appear publicly. In fact, it certainly won't appear publicly until the church is closed. This is the reality there. How many churches per month do we think we'll need to do? Well, the numbers are looking, as Judith said, she can't confirm, there is no definitive list, but if we're working to 300 to 400 churches closing in the next 2 to 3 years, maybe, but we don't know at what scale or what accelerated. The only honest answer I can give to that is we're just going to start as soon as we can. So everybody in this call, hopefully you're going to get in contact with me tomorrow to be added to our potential church recording volunteer mailing list. How are you going to obtain and train the volunteers? That's what tonight's all about. And we'll do more training as we go. And is there a checking aspect to the record? How do you plan to monitor accuracy and comparison between different recorders? Qualitative research is difficult, but it is a volunteer-led scheme. We're going to make the best of what we can do. This is not going to be a year-long exercise in every church. It just can't be, because people don't have the time to do that. So a record is better than no record whatsoever. Elizabeth Rhodes asks, I'm concerned about the duplication of recording, which has already been done. So are we, is the honest answer there. But as Leslie said, we haven't seen these because they're not easily publicly available. There should also be said that what's in the church today is not necessarily the same as what was in the church 20 years ago. Churches have closed, churches have came, new things have been donated, things have arrived. This is a snapshot of these churches as places of worship in 2023. Elizabeth also asked, how will the work of previous volunteers be incorporated into the project? Well, I would imagine those works are copyright, so we can allude to them, we can add messages to them if we find them, if we know of them. But if the volunteers want to come forward again and help, that would be fabulous. We're not trying to stand on anybody's toes. There's no effort to duplicate. We don't want to. This is just a project to try and make sure that as much recording is done as possible. Is it possible to map what has been recorded before these records can be created rather than duplicated? It might save labour in the longer term. Yes, that would be a job from our side, and working with Judith as well to make sure that as little duplication happens as possible. What happens to the fixtures and fittings, etc., when the church isn't listed? Asks Jane.
Right, gives us more flexibility, I will say. Yeah, depends on the wishes of the congregation. So the general trustees have a duty to try and get best value from the buildings, and so we don't want things removing that will actually make it difficult to sell. It's not in the congregation's interest to do that. But again, if there are things that they want to move, it gives us a lot more flexibility about doing that. So, but potentially it's still, the outcome is still the same. But I know, things like pipe organs, it's much easier to move them if they're in an unlisted building.
Thank you. I missed a question earlier from Morag, the question. Well, it ends with a question. DJ, the CSA SCH inventory had a series of questions and info sheets for this purpose. Do you want a copy? Yes, please. You can. I organise this event on Eventbrite, so my email is on there. But in case anybody hasn't got it, it's director@scotlandschurchestrust.org.uk. I would happily take anything you want to send that my way. Thank you very much, Morag. Joe has said there seems to be no shortage of people needing spaces to come together in, and former churches would be wonderful. The naughty bit seems to be the upkeep of buildings and paying the bills. Is there guidance or a toolkit for a community asset transfer? Well, it's not really the focus of tonight, but I think Victoria is the best place to answer about as we look to the future of buildings. Victoria, do you have a quick answer on that?
Yes, I mean, I'm happy to have a more detailed conversation with you about this, Joe, but there is a piece of guidance that's just been developed between ourselves, Heritage Trust Network, and Community Ownership Support Scotland, which is sort of a toolkit to look at mixed use of a building. If it's for sale, it's passing out of denominational ownership, and a community are looking to acquire it, and they're wanting to retain an element of occasional worship, weddings and funerals and so on, but also to introduce a variety of other probably sort of secular uses. So the document we're producing has some suggestions about how to achieve that. There's some very good guidance as well, mainly from England, the Crossing the Threshold toolkit, which was the Diocese of Hereford, I think. They're just about to reissue that fantastic resource on introducing elements of the wider mixed use from the community. The other interesting one is the Plunkett Foundation, who have a programme about community businesses in places of worship. So I think there's lots of stuff out there. One of the challenges is trying to draw it together in a coherent way for people to find.
Thank you for that. So there's much on that question. There's much coming down the pipeline this year. So watch this space and have a look at Victoria's Twitter account, in particular, Historic Churches Scotland, to find out more about that. We're on to our last few questions. I've just had a quick scan through the webinar chat as well. Colin, I like your comment. You might like to track down the TV programme about rescuing organs. Look for Organ Stop, Saving the King of Instruments on BBC iPlayer. That's my nighttime viewing as soon as this is over. There's also a wonderful project out there called Sound of Organ, which you should have a look at Google for as well. They're looking at how to protect organs in Scotland and try and give them much more of a national prominence, international prominence in the Scottish organs. Lucy asks, how prepared are local authorities for the influx of listed building consent applications concerning a building type they're not generally experienced in dealing with? And are they being prepared on the particular specialisms of churches? For example, the flooring, is that being discussed? Have you any thoughts on that, Judith?
Obviously, because I no longer work for HES, I'm probably not supposed to answer this, but I think the answer is they're not, right. Unless HES are doing more that I'm unaware of.
And in my previous role with a small well-known conservation charity, the Coburn Association. You know, I dealt a little bit with this on the side, and it is clear that local authorities are overstretched their planning departments, and this will certainly add to their burden down the line. So I think, but
authorities don't actually understand, so the difference between things which need listed building consent and things which are covered under ecclesiastical exemption. So I think as soon as that, they might stand a better chance with standard listed building applications, but the specialisms, no, I don't think they have enough people.
I think this is where our wonderful colleagues, such as the Society for the Protection of Ancient Buildings and other similar groups, will be coming to the fore as they help local authorities understand, because they're going to have to help these new owners understand their responsibilities. And Colin asks, there are a lot of chapels in Wales that are likely to close over the next few years. Could the recording package be made available to them? Absolutely, it can. I'm happy to share this with anyone. I'm a historian and an archaeologist. I want to make sure that as much of this is recorded. This is vital social history, and future generations of researchers will not thank us if we miss this opportunity to make this record. So absolutely, Colin, very happy to share that. I don't think, I'm just having a quick scroll through the chat. There's one. Last one from Joe says Scottish Civic Trust will absolutely work with local communities to comment on planning consents. Please Google them. Absolutely. So get straight on Google after this. Everyone over a cup of tea. Have a look for the Scottish Civic Trust. Final question then from Morag. Will the Heritage Trust Network Ailsa from BEFS jumped in there, happy to share work with the BEFS working group, Conservation Officers Forum, all from local authorities representatives. That's great. If you don't know Built Environment Forum Scotland, great advocacy service. They're working away behind the scenes as well. They provide the Secretariat for the National Places of Worship Forum as well. So Google BEFS, BEFS as well. Last question from Morag. Will the Heritage Trust Network Scotland not have guidance for taking historic buildings into community ownership? I think that may deal with things like that. The Scottish Network branch have various toolkits. Any thoughts, Victoria?
Yes, they do, but we also recognise that churches are a very particular sort of building and have issues all of their own, which is why we've worked with Heritage Trust Network and Community Ownership Support Scotland on a church-specific resource. It's not live yet, but we're working with Heritage Trust Network to create a church-specific landing page on the HTN website. So look out for that coming.
Thank you very much. Well, thank you everybody in the audience for your great questions. Any final thoughts from my fantastic colleagues in this part of the sector on church recording or in general about where we are? Anything you'd like to add?
Can I just say that, you know, if anybody wants to get in touch and show the presentation I did tonight on a Zoom call, then I'm very happy to do that. If you want to share it with your colleagues or local congregations or any community group really that might be interested, obviously you can see this on the recording of this on YouTube, but I'm very happy to eventually. I'm very happy to do a Zoom call if you want to contact DJ and we could set something up.
That'd be grand. You could also read Leslie's blog about doing church recording on our website, on our blogs at scotlandschurchestrust.org.uk, and you'll find that I think I'm supposed to go, and that'll be in the YouTube down below in the comments section, just there. That's for the future for the recording. Judith, do you have any other things you?
Not particularly, I don't think. Yeah, as I say, it's just an awful lot of work needs to be done.
There's a huge amount of work ahead of us. Victoria?
Yeah, I think just echoing that from Judith, but actually making the point that if we work together and some sort of joined up action between both individuals who are personally interested, but organisations, then we stand a much better chance by all collaborating.
Absolutely, absolutely, and collaboration is key. You know, we've worked a lot in the last month or two as we've tried to get this off the ground. We've talked to a lot of heritage associations, archaeological societies, civic groups around the country who would like to be involved in this. The answer is everybody get in touch. We'll share your information and we'll try and get this going. Thanks so much for all of your contributions this evening, ladies, and thank you everybody who's come along on a chilly February evening to a Zoom to about this important topic. We'll get this up on YouTube as soon as possible, and we'll be in touch again soon. Thanks now.